On the 7th of July, 1937, fighting broke out between units of the Imperial Japanese Army and the Chinese National Revolutionary Army, sparking what would become known to history as the Second Sino-Japanese War, but which many Japanese at the time would eventually come to call the China War. Finding support for the war lacking, the government of Japan initiated a program of spiritual mobilization designed to build up grassroots support among ordinary Japanese for the Army's imperial adventures. By 1939, the China War had turned into a quagmire from which Japan could not extricate itself. It was once said that the Kingdom of Italy had a large appetite but bad teeth, and the same analogy could easily apply to Japan. When the conflict showed no signs of coming to an end anytime soon, the spiritual mobilization campaign began to fail, and the government turned to more concrete, practical measures to ensure the backing of the population. One of the ways this manifested itself was in the Tonarigumi, neighborhood associations. This was a system of organization which evolved as the China War became just one theater of the Second World War, so this video will examine the Tonarigumi in the early stages of development. In March of 1939, Araki Sadao, a general of the Japanese Army, took over leadership of the Spiritual Mobilization Committee responsible for, spiritual mobilization, and it began to advocate several principles for how Japanese should conduct themselves. Rising early, gratitude and thanks, cooperation for Japan, public labor service, strict punctuality, thrift, physical discipline, and spiritual discipline. Therefore, the movement began to lead drives to collect everything from scrap metal and rubber to wood so charcoal could be made, to cooking grease, to paper, and instructed citizens of Japan to waste not, want not, all for the war effort. One of the main themes of Japanese history is that of dual power structures. In other words, the tension between how laws said the country should operate and how it actually did on the ground. Since the 800s, as a way to help get around this, Japanese villages were often organized into small administrative groups, often led by a headman, and eventually, it would lead to remarkable levels of village autonomy regardless of whether or not there was some sort of lord involved, especially in the 15th and 16th centuries. The Spiritual Mobilization Committee attempted to solidify local administration, something the government as a whole had been trying to do since the late 1920s, by taking those systems of organization which already existed and concentrating them into burakukai, community councils. While Imperial Japan was an extremely repressive state, it was, at least in this regard, possibly the least repressive of the Axis governments, and this is one example of an area of Japanese life which was never fully under upper governmental control, despite attempts at trying. Organization in Japanese villages came in two forms: voluntary associations which came together to do things such as fight fires or harvest collective fields, or do repairs, and civic groups created in the early stages of the Japanese Empire with direct support from the government, with an example of this being veterans organizations. What the Japanese government attempted to do was merge these two structures under the authority of the community councils and make them officially part of the governing apparatus. But the government never abolished either of the two preceding power structures, which is why these things never fell completely under governmental control. Historian Thomas Haven summarizes the problems in doing this fairly well. The first push to start community councils came in early 1938, when spiritual mobilization leaders and the Home Ministry began setting them up to mark the 50th anniversary of local rule. Osaka, Japan's second city, responded with formidable zeal. It distributed 500,000 handbills urging let's form new community councils desired by all city residents, and by the day of the ceremonies, it claimed 2,699 councils, compared with just 344 of them 2 months earlier. Kobe and Yokohama quietly followed suit, using their public health cooperatives that had long existed for preventing dockside epidemics as cornerstones for the new organizations. The councils in April 1938 were transparently nothing but paper entities, confined almost wholly to whatever long-standing activities they had carried out before being renamed community councils. Tokyo was a good example of how the organizational shell began to take substance in 1938 and 1939. The city fathers decided to use the April 17th festivities to issue an outline of provisions for community councils in Tokyo, a detailed list of instructions to the city's 3,601 councils that was emblematic of the movement as a whole. The outline announced a great deal of structural frippery, and then identified the council's purpose: to cooperate in self-rule, contribute to expanding the public good, and plan for the advancement and fulfillment of people's livelihoods in accord with the traditional good customs of neighborly mutual aid and joint responsibility. Havens goes on to write, the city government soon discovered that Tokyo could not be organized by fiat or exhortation alone. Her 6 million residents usually had little in common with their neighbors, and no sense of crisis had yet prevailed in 1938 and 1939 to drive them together. Community councils seemed to work best when they conformed to political or postal subdivisions, although this often trapped them to the flypaper of administrative routine. Sometimes it also turned them into support organizations for the re-election of a local politician. And certainly not all volunteer groups relished the standardization that was being thrust on them from the city and the home ministry, whether they agreed with the spiritual mobilization or not. Despite such ruffles, the community councils and neighborhood associations are occasionally regarded as a blunt system of organizing and mobilizing individual citizens for the purpose of controlling them from above, based on the ancient notion of conveying the will of the authorities to those below. In the months after Pearl Harbor, these organizations took on so many duties and drew so many people into their activities that so concise a description is a poor fit. Even as they were forming in the late 1930s, it is not clear how authoritarian the councils and associations were. The government naturally pretended that these groups were spontaneous outpourings of public sentiment, which they manifestly were not. But without some measure of local cooperation, it would have been impossible to thrust such organizations onto the people from above. Tokyo, in particular, apparently shunned any pretense of uniformity and tried for most of 1930 to let actual residents devise their own methods for establishing them. In other words, the attempt to create neighborhood associations to help with the organization of wartime Japan went through traditional channels and traditional power structures. Because of this, local elites and prominent families and other potential avenues of power, drawing on a long tradition of community autonomy and responsibility to residents, provided a serious check on governmental power which the Japanese state never fully resolved, especially not in the early stages. The nebulous nature of the spiritual mobilization campaign lent its appeal to traditional structures and notions of good neighborliness, and it was designed to appeal to an idealized concept of the past, especially village life. In 1938, Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro declared that Japan would establish a new order in East Asia, and when the neighborhood association was subsumed into it in 1940, there were 79,280 councils in cities and towns, and 118,430 in villages. As the war progressed, they would become increasingly radicalized and more important for organizing and regimenting daily life for the war effort. It is for this and other reasons that, among professional historians of the Japanese Empire, there is a significant and unsettled debate over the question of fascism in Imperial Japan. If that does indeed apply, it may very well not be emperor-centered fascism, as some have argued, but instead welling up from the neighborhood organizations, which became increasingly radicalized as the Pacific fighting dragged on. Fascism from below.